On the afternoon of April 15th, 1992, a 24-year-old woman named Lisa Ziegert drove through the quiet suburban streets of Agawam, Massachusetts. And eventually, she pulled into a shopping plaza in the center of town, which was full of shops and restaurants and bars. So Lisa was a teacher's aide at the local middle school. And while teaching was definitely her passion, the reality was being a teacher's aide did not pay very well. So, to earn some extra money, she also worked the evening shift at a store called Brittany's Card and Gift Shop, which sold things like birthday cards and stuffed animals and music boxes. As she drove through the lot looking for a parking space, she passed by a chicken restaurant where her friend Ed Borgatti worked. So Ed shared a house with Lisa's boyfriend, Blair Masoya, as well as Lisa's sister, Lynn. So the four of them were all pretty close. And so as Lisa found her spot and parked her car and got out, she thought about popping into the restaurant to say hi to Ed, who was also working that day. But when she checked her time, she thought better of it, and instead she just walked straight to the gift store to start her shift. A few hours later, around 7 p.m., Lisa sat behind the counter at the gift store, humming along to the song that was playing on the overhead speakers. Lisa was the only employee on duty during the evening shifts, and she was there until the store closed at 9 p.m. And working alone so late at night definitely made her a little bit anxious. And, she did every now and again have issues with problem customers. And so she was just always kind of a bit on edge, especially considering, some rowdy people often came out of the pool hall that was just a few doors down, and they sometimes came in the shop and were just kind of a handful. And on top of all that, there was something else going on that Lisa actually couldn't quite explain. Lately, she'd been having this weird feeling that somebody was watching her through the windows of the store. So, as Lisa is sitting behind the counter, feeling, very anxious and sort of stressed about the night, she hears the sound of the door to the shop opening. There was a bell above the door that jingled every time the door opened. And so she whipped around to see who it was, and she was very relieved to see that it was actually just her older sister Lynn, not some random customer who might be a problem. Lisa was really close with Lynn, and sometimes her sister would just stop by to chat and keep Lisa company, especially during her evening shifts. So Lynn walked in and asked Lisa how things were going, and Lisa said it was fine, and then eventually she sort of shifted the conversation to how, Lisa was still sort of upset that she had not been able to land a full-time teaching job yet. She told Lynn that what she really wanted here was just, a teaching job that paid better than what she had now so that she could quit this gift store job. Not only because this late night shift really creeped her out, but also because she'd be able to spend more time with her boyfriend Blair if she just had this full-time teaching job instead of splitting these two jobs. And so the two sisters continued to chat for about a half an hour, and then Lisa walked Lynn to the door and waved goodbye. And as Lisa watched her sister drive away in her car, Lisa suddenly became aware of the fact that the parking lot of this plaza was really full tonight, and there were lines of cars, of people honking at each other trying to get, the few remaining spots. And as Lisa stood there in the gift shop's doorway, she looked over and saw that the owner of the carpet shop next door, James Dent, was closing up. And James, he looked over, saw Lisa, and he made a comment about how crazy the parking lot was tonight. And Lisa was like, yeah, it gets pretty busy at night, but this is even, crazier than usual. After that, the two said goodbye and they went their separate ways. And Lisa, she turned right around and went back inside the gift store. About an hour later, around 8:20 p.m., Lisa rang up a customer at the counter. She handed the customer his change and his receipt and told him to have a good night. And then once he was gone, she went into the back room to take inventory before closing. After such a long and stressful day, Lisa was really glad that her shift was nearly over. In about 40 minutes, she was going to close up the shop and then maybe walk over to see if Ed was still working at the restaurant, chat with him for a bit, and then head home. But just then, Lisa heard the sound of that bell on the door, which meant somebody was coming in. So she stepped out of the back to see who it was. The next morning, so April 16th, 1992, Detective Wayne Macy of the Agawam Police Department stepped into Brittany's Card and Gift Shop. When he got in there, he saw that there were already officers from his department putting up crime scene tape and taking photos of the scene. One of the officers came over to Macy to fill him in, and they explained that morning, one of the employees from this gift shop had called 911. And what she said is she got to work that morning to start her shift at the gift shop, and right away when she arrived, she noticed something odd. She saw one of her coworkers, Lisa Ziegert, who normally worked the night shift and closed the shop down. She saw her car was out in the parking lot. And so that was odd because she shouldn't be here. She works at night. And then this woman who ultimately called 911, her name is Sophia, she went up to the storefront and found the door was unlocked. And also when she stepped inside, all the lights were on and the overhead speakers were still playing. And so, Sophia's thinking, that's odd, like is Lisa working this morning or something? But she searched the whole store and Lisa was nowhere to be found, even though all her belongings were still in the store. And so ultimately, she called the police. The officer also told Macy that they had already spoken to the man who owned the shop right next door, the carpet shop. And the owner of that store said he had actually spoken to Lisa the night before around maybe 7:30 p.m. And at the time, she was acting totally normal, seemed very happy. They were just talking about, how hectic the parking lot was that night. Detective Macy asked the officer if anyone had been in touch with any of Lisa's family or friends to see if anybody had heard from her or seen her. And the officer said that they had been in touch with those people and that no one had seen or heard from her since last night. Additionally, the officer said that Lisa's roommate had said Lisa never came home. And she also had not shown up to her other job at the middle school that morning where she was a teacher's aide. At this point, the officer told Macy that, hey, you just got to come in the back of the store because what we found in there make it really obvious that what we're dealing with here is foul play. So Macy said, all right, lead the way. And he followed this officer into the back room of the shop. And as soon as he looked inside, his heart sank. There were all these cardboard boxes in the back room that had been sort of flattened, like one or maybe multiple people were laying on all these boxes, and there was blood all over the boxes. And so based on this, it seemed pretty apparent to Macy and the other officers that, if Lisa is not here right now, but her things are here, her car is here, like she didn't disappear voluntarily. Like all the initial evidence suggests that she was taken away by force. As Macy was walking around this small back room, he noticed there was actually a back door that had been left partially open that no officers had touched. So this is how it was left. And he walked over and he opened this door and he saw this door led to this narrow back alley that ran behind the building. Also, as Macy was looking at this back door, he looked down and he saw what appeared to be, pretty obvious scuff marks across the ground, as if maybe somebody had been dragged and their shoes had sort of scuffed the ground on the way out. And so Macy stepped into this back alleyway to see if there was any nearby security cameras that could have potentially captured whatever happened back here the night before, but he didn't see any. So he left the alley and he went to the front and he began going to the other stores in this plaza to see if any of them had cameras that potentially faced like the front of the shop. But Macy was very disappointed to learn that none of these shops had security cameras. So there was going to be no footage of whatever happened here. And so at this point, Macy knew this was going to be a really challenging case to solve. Because he had no eyewitnesses, at least not right now, and no security camera footage, it meant there was no clear, easy way to try to figure out what the assailant looked like, or what their car could have looked like, or even what direction they might have gone. Like he had nothing. And so Macy went right to his car, he grabbed his radio, and he called dispatch, and he told them to right now send out search teams, police dogs, and scour every inch of this area for any sign of Lisa. After that, Macy went back inside the shop to check the cash register. He figured if this was a robbery, that very likely the money would be missing. But when he got in there and he opened it up, the cash was still inside. But Macy knew that violent attacks by random strangers was pretty rare. More often than not, people who get killed or people who get kidnapped, their perpetrator or perpetrators are people they know. At some point, Macy pressed a few buttons on the cash register, and it began to spit out this paper log of all the most recent transactions. And Macy saw that the last purchase, at least as reflected on this register, was made with cash at 8:20 p.m. the night before. And for the first time, Macy actually felt a surge of optimism about this case, because this was a very helpful clue. Since the gift store closed at 9 p.m., this narrowed down the time window significantly. It meant the attack likely happened in the 40 minutes between that transaction at 8:20 and closing at 9 p.m., a time when very few of the other businesses in the plaza were open, except for the restaurants and pool hall. That afternoon, Detective Macy knocked on the door of Lisa's parents' house. The search at the shopping plaza was now fully underway, and a team of officers was already searching Lisa's apartment across town for clues. And in the meantime, Macy wanted to speak to Lisa's family and see if they knew anything. When Lisa's mother opened the door, she looked frantic, but she also seemed relieved that a police officer was finally there to fill her in on what was happening. And so she told Macy to come in, and Macy stepped into a house that was absolutely buzzing with activity. As the detective entered the dining room, he saw that at least a dozen people, most of them around Lisa's age, were gathered around the table. They had this big map spread out on the table and were talking about maybe organizing their own search effort. And then when they saw Detective Macy, they all sort of flocked around him and began peppering him with questions about what happened to Lisa, where is she? Macy told the group, which consisted mainly of friends and some family, that he would speak to all of them one by one, but in an orderly fashion. And he would start with Lisa's mother. The group seemed to understand this and kind of naturally throttled back. And then at that point, Macy took Lisa's mother, they went into the living room, and they sat down to talk. The first question he asked her was, do you know of anybody out there who might have wanted to harm your daughter? And Lisa's mother immediately said, no way. Lisa did not have any enemies. She was quite friendly, very hardworking, and really just stayed out of trouble. And for the rest of this interview, which lasted, another 30 minutes or so, that really was the sentiment that Lisa's mother communicated, that this was totally unheard of, that anything would happen to Lisa. She never did anything wrong. She had no problems. She had no enemies. I don't know what happened. And so Macy, after speaking to the mother, would also speak to Lisa's father, her two sisters, and her roommate. And then also he would speak to her boyfriend Blair and Blair's roommate, Ed Borgatti. Blair seemed really broken up about his girlfriend's disappearance. When Macy asked where he had been the night before, Blair said he was at his mother's home for most of the night, except for a quick trip to CVS. He said he didn't remember the exact time he went there, but he definitely had the receipt back at home. And when Macy spoke to Ed, so Blair's roommate, Ed also seemed really upset about what happened to Lisa. He told Macy that he and Lisa were definitely good friends and they worked near each other in that shopping plaza. And he said he'd actually been working at the chicken restaurant around the same time of Lisa's disappearance. Again, most violent attacks are not committed by strangers. They're committed by people who know their victims. And here was a potential suspect who not only, knew Lisa very well, but was also just a few hundred feet away when she was attacked and potentially abducted. It just seemed almost too obvious. So Macy made a note to be sure to look into Ed very thoroughly and see if any of Lisa's friends knew about maybe any tension between those two. However, as Macy would go around and question all of Lisa's friends who were at the house, none of them had anything negative to say about Ed or Blair, and none of them knew anything useful about Lisa's disappearance. However, one of Lisa's friends did say that about a week earlier, Lisa had told her about this feeling she had of being watched while she was at the store. But Lisa hadn't actually said anything about why she felt that way or who she thought was watching her. So even though it was an interesting lead, Macy knew it would be virtually impossible to actually follow up on. And at this point, he was just getting a little frustrated, because not only did he have no eyewitness or security footage of Lisa's abduction, it seemed absolutely no one even had a motive to harm Lisa. In fact, the only useful piece of information he got from all the interviews was from Lisa's sister, Lynn, who said she had stopped by the store about an hour or two before Lisa disappeared. She was able to give Macy a very detailed description of what Lisa was wearing: a denim skirt, boots, and a charm bracelet. And so by the time Macy was leaving the home, he felt really disappointed by how little he had uncovered. He just hoped that the officers in charge of the search effort were maybe having more luck. 3 days later, on the afternoon of Sunday, April 19th, Detective Macy parked at the edge of the woods off Route 75, less than a mile from the gift store. Seconds later, another police cruiser pulled up right behind him. So earlier that afternoon, a man had been out walking his dog in these woods, and he had unfortunately come across a dead body and had called it in. And so Macy, when he heard this, had driven straight over here, thinking this could be Lisa's body. And now, as he got out of his cruiser, he saw there were tire tracks that the man who had called in the body had said he had also seen. He said there were tracks near the body, and so Macy's thinking, okay, I gotta follow these tracks and it will likely bring me to this body. And so Macy, along with 3 other officers, began following these tracks into the trees. But Macy, who was at the front of this group, only took a few steps before his feet literally sank down into the mud to the point where it was up to his ankles. This area would turn out to be extremely swampy, to the point where the officers actually had to walk in each other's footprints in a single file line just to try to navigate this mud. And so into the woods they went, carefully walking in this straight line until the tire tracks began to fade. At this point, Macy and the others looked around and, there was no body where they were, and there was no sign of any body or anything unusual. But the man who had found the body had said these tracks sort of aimed in the direction of where the body was found. And so Macy and the others just continued in that single file line, sort of just trudging directly into the woods for hours, until finally they did reach this small out-of-the-way clearing. And in the clearing, Macy and the others saw clothing items scattered all over the place. At this point, it was starting to get dark, and so Macy pulled out his flashlight and he shined it around in this clearing. And at some point, his beam of light landed on a woman's body lying right next to a tree. She was partially naked, and some of her clothes that she still had on had been pulled down. So it seemed fairly obvious that she had been sexually assaulted before she died. Also, there were clearly multiple stab wounds all over her body, including one to her throat. And then when Macy crouched down next to her to get a better look, his flashlight reflected off of a charm bracelet on her wrist. Less than an hour later, Detective Macy had to shield his eyes as a floodlight clicked on and threw blinding light all over this clearing he was in. A forensics team had just arrived and fired up their generators so they could work through the night with lights. And also overhead, a helicopter now circled the woods, taking aerial photos of the scene. These woods, at least from Macy's perspective, were such a maze that it seemed very likely that the killer must be a local who knew this area well. And also, if they'd driven through all that mud, Macy figured that whoever they were looking for likely was driving a vehicle with four-wheel drive, like a truck or a Jeep. So he told the forensics team to make a cast of the tire tracks that were left behind near the edge of the road to see if there was anything else they could find out about the vehicle. And then Macy also quietly was sort of crossing his fingers that this forensics team would also be able to hopefully find a trace of the killer's DNA on Lisa's body. A few days later, Macy was sitting at his desk at the police station. The phones in the bullpen were ringing more than usual that day, but Macy was doing his best to shut the noise out and just focus on the reports that were on his desk. The forensics team had found DNA on Lisa's body, and so now Macy had to make a list of all the potential suspects that he would need to collect DNA samples from to see if any of them were a match to the DNA found on Lisa's body. Lisa's boyfriend, Blair, seemed like an obvious suspect, even though none of Lisa's friends or family had known about any problems in their relationship. Blair also had handed over that receipt from CBS that confirmed he was there around the same time that Lisa was abducted. But it would have only taken about, maybe 3 minutes to drive from the CVS to the gift store. So it seemed, completely possible to Macy that, Blair could have attacked Lisa while he was out and just also grabbed the CVS receipt to sort of build an alibi, but a shaky one. Another strong suspect was actually Blair's roommate, Ed. His alibi was that he'd been working at a restaurant right next to the gift store when Lisa was kidnapped, which just seemed way too convenient. And so Macy thought, it was entirely possible that Ed, during his shift, could have snuck over to the shop, maybe killed Lisa right there in the store and then left her there. And then, after his shift was over, because he knows no one's going to be back in that gift shop, he could have gone back over, grabbed the body, disposed of her in the woods, and nobody knows. And on top of that, Ed just so happened to own a Jeep. So now Macy clearly needed to get DNA samples from both Blair and Ed, and also Macy planned to analyze the tires of both of their vehicles to see if either of them matched the tracks from the woods. Suddenly, though, the constant ringing of the bullpen phones just became too much for Macy to ignore. And so he stood up from his work, sort of annoyed, and he walked over to see, what was going on. Why are there so many calls happening right now? And one of the officers that was out there said all these calls were for the Lisa Ziegert tip line. Macy was sort of surprised to hear that. He knew the tip line had been set up, but for the past few days, there really hadn't been many calls. But the officer told Macy that, the floodlights in the forest and the helicopters flying over the woods the night before had really caught the attention of the local news. And as soon as word got out that, Lisa's body had been found out there, almost everyone in Agawam seemed to have a theory about what had happened, and now they were calling in their theory. But he said that these tips were sort of all over the map, and there were already dozens of different descriptions of suspicious vehicles or suspicious people that, could be suspects. Macy told the officer to, keep doing his job and to make sure you log all the tips that come in, and that Macy and his team would look through them one by one when they had a chance. And as Macy turned and walked back towards his office and he continued to hear all these phones ringing, he realized his team might have to do a whole lot more DNA comparisons than he'd originally planned on. Because this was the early 90s, there was no way to have one DNA sample like you would find on a body, let's say, and then just put it into a bank and see what turns up. That didn't exist. And so what he's saying is he needs to compare this sample directly to basically all these potential people and hope one of them lines up. One full year later, on a morning in 1993, Detective Macy dug through a cardboard box full of police reports and interview notes. There were dozens of boxes just like this one stacked all over his office, and they were all full of files on the Lisa Ziegert investigation. Macy and his team of detectives had spent the entire past year basically working around the clock on this case, digging into one lead after another, and it had been exhausting. Since Agawam was such a small town, Lisa's murder was all anyone could talk about, and the detectives had received hundreds of tips on Lisa's case. The police station even had to install extra phones to handle all the calls. And no matter how far-fetched the tips seemed, Macy's team looked into each and every one. For example, there was a woman who worked at the all-female gym that Lisa used to go to who had called in and said there was this man who showed up at their gym every day at 3 p.m. and he would buy frozen yogurt from the juice bar. But while he ate the yogurt, he would just stand there and eat it, sort of staring out at all the women. And to this woman, this employee, she felt like he could be the killer. Another tipster had called in and said they actually had seen a police car parked right near the gift store around the time Lisa was abducted. And when Macy heard this, he ordered a DNA test from every single officer in the department, but none matched. There was also another wild theory that Lisa's boyfriend, Blair, apparently had a secret romance with his roommate, Ed. And Ed had apparently killed Lisa because Lisa found out about it. Somebody else had called in and said that their friend had borrowed their car on the day Lisa was killed, and when they returned the car, apparently there were bloodstains in it. So they were basically saying, look into my friend. And then also, there were all these women who called in basically saying their husbands did it. Whether or not there was merit there, wasn't clear, but lots of husbands were getting accused. There were also dozens of tips that were just too vague to do anything with, like people saying that they saw a man in a dark coat or a guy at a bar who looked suspicious. And so at the end of the first year of this investigation, Detective Macy had looked into 400 people of interest, but none of those leads went anywhere. To Macy's disappointment, Blair and Ed, who were really the two most obvious suspects, were actually ruled out very quickly. Their tires from their vehicles ultimately didn't match the tracks found in the woods, and they'd both given DNA samples, which did not match the DNA found on Lisa's body. And it was hard to get samples from all, the rest of the 400 other suspects, especially because in 1993, you needed a pretty significant amount of DNA to run a test. So the police typically made suspects come in and get their blood drawn. And a lot of the suspects just said no to that, because they just didn't want to go through the hassle. And since most of the tips that had led to these people of interest were pretty flimsy, Macy didn't have probable cause to get a warrant to force them to do the blood draw. But of the hundreds of suspects who did give their DNA, none matched the DNA found on Lisa's body. And again, there's no bank to just run the sample through to see who else it could be. Like if you don't have somebody to compare it to, you couldn't do it in the early 90s. So, as Macy stood there looking at all those boxes of files that he'd spent months poring over, he had the sinking feeling that maybe the answer was not in there after all. At this point, it was like every tip he had gotten had led him down like an entirely different path than he was on, and he was just more lost and confused than ever. And so he felt like if he was going to actually find Lisa's killer, he needed new evidence or he needed an eyewitness to help point him in the right direction. And so, as daunting as it was for Macy to think of this, he knew what he really needed now was actually even more tips. 6 months later, in the fall of 1993, so now we are about a year and a half after Lisa Ziegert's murder, Detective Macy stood in the corner of a massive call center in Burbank, California. All around him, dozens of workers sat in cubicles with computers and headsets, and Macy waited with nervous anticipation as one by one their phones began to ring. Macy knew that the very popular TV show, Unsolved Mysteries, which told real stories of unsolved cold cases, was actually airing a segment about Lisa's murder at that very moment. But he wasn't actually watching the show. Instead, he was in the studio's call center to monitor the tip line, in case any viewers at home called in with valuable information on Lisa's case. And sure enough, within a few minutes, every single phone in the call center was ringing off the hook. Macy began to walk around the room and peek over the shoulders of the workers as they took notes on these calls that were coming in. And Macy admittedly was frustrated by what he was seeing. Most of the callers were just repeating this old rumor that Ed Borgatti was the killer, and that more than that, the police knew about it and were covering it up. So the reason for that is Ed actually had been ruled out by DNA evidence pretty early on in the investigation, but the police had decided not to announce that publicly until the case was closed. So the locals came up with a conspiracy theory to explain why Ed, who looked so suspicious from the outside, had never been arrested, that somehow the police were covering it up. Macy had hoped that by having this case be on Unsolved Mysteries, that it would lead to a fresh tip from a credible witness who maybe hadn't come forward yet. But instead, all he was getting was just more rumor and more speculation. In the end, the show generated 212 tips, and none of them led anywhere. And so as the years went on and still no new information came in, Lisa's case just continued to get colder and colder. By the time Detective Macy actually retired in 2003, it had been 11 years since her murder. Yet still, the murder was unsolved. Almost 23 years later, in January of 2015, Anthony Gallooni, the newly elected district attorney, walked down the hallway at the Agawam Police Headquarters. He found the door he was looking for, and he knocked. And a few seconds later, a detective named Mark Pfau opened the door. Gallooni introduced himself and then asked to see all the files on the Lisa Ziegert investigation. Gallooni told the detective that he had grown up near Agawam and he vividly remembered watching the news coverage of Lisa's murder when he was just 12 years old. And now that he was the DA, solving the cold case was one of his top priorities. Forensic technology had advanced a lot since the early 90s when this case was in its full swing. So Gallooni suggested they just send the DNA sample from Lisa's killer to the lab for phenotyping, which is basically using DNA markers to figure out what a person could look like. So this is not the same thing as putting the DNA into a huge bank and getting an exact match back. It's sort of like building a profile of who this belongs to. And so the DA was very confident that through this process, if they could build a really accurate physical profile of the suspect and cross-reference it against the hundreds of names they had collected over the years in this case, maybe they could finally close in on Lisa's killer. It would take over a year and a half for this process to be completed, but in September of 2016, DA Gallooni held a press conference to announce the results of the phenotyping. And so, during this press conference, a composite sketch of the killer appeared on the screen behind the DA. And all it showed was a Caucasian man with dark hair and either brown or hazel eyes, which does seem like not a whole lot of new information. But remember, this is sort of like, definitely this person looks this way. This is not like we think he looks this way. This is what he looks like. And even though none of the investigators on the case actually recognized the face in the sketch, Gallooni hoped that somebody in the public, from this press release, would recognize him. So after the press conference, Gallooni went back to the police station, and with the help of a state trooper, they began sorting through the massive cabinets full of files on Lisa's case. They put together a list of every person of interest who had previously refused to give a DNA sample, and they were able to narrow it down to 11 suspects who fit the phenotype profile who didn't give their DNA sample. At that point, Gallooni pulled together all the evidence that he had against those 11 people, and he used it to secure warrants, forcing each of them to actually give their DNA. But before those DNA results even came back, Galuni got a very unexpected phone call. And as he listened to the voice on the other end, his heart began to pound because he knew after, 2.5 decades here, he finally knew exactly who had killed Lisa Ziegert. Based on a written confession and DNA evidence, this is what police believe happened to Lisa Ziegert on April 15th, 1992. Around 8:30 p.m., the killer parked in the alley behind Brittany's card and gift shop. Then they walked around to the front of the store and hid behind a car and stared in the window and just watched Lisa. The killer had always been fascinated by abduction and bondage ever since they were young. And they had done their best to try to, keep those fantasies inside and not act on them. But when they had met Lisa, it was like their urges became just too powerful to control. So on this night, when they saw Lisa disappear into the store's back room, the killer, steeled themselves, then took a deep breath and stormed into the shop, just as they had imagined doing for so long. They had thought about this and fantasized about what this would be like, and now it was actually happening. And so they ambushed Lisa with a knife right as she was walking out of that back room, and they kind of grabbed her and wrapped their arm around her neck, and they sort of stumbled into the back room, and Lisa, she began fighting back. And so they're struggling, and they knocked over that huge pile of cardboard boxes, and at some point Lisa tried to wrestle the knife out of the killer's grip. But after this intense struggle, the killer gained the upper hand and dragged her out the back door and into the alley. They shoved her into their vehicle and then drove a mile down the road and turned onto a dirt path that led into the woods. And then after they drove for a while, they reached a secluded spot in the forest, at which point they stopped, they pulled Lisa out of the back of the car, they threw her to the ground, and then they sexually assaulted her. And then after they were done, they stabbed her to death. And then they just left her, and they got back in their vehicle and they drove away. By the time the killer got back to their own home, they were still buzzing with adrenaline. I mean, this was every bit as incredible as they thought it would be. However, when they actually walked into their house and they heard a familiar female voice calling out from the other room asking where they'd been, the killer looked down and suddenly realized there were cuts all over their hands. But at this point, it was too late to do anything about these cuts. Like, if they left to go clean up, they would just seem really suspicious to the woman in the next room. So the killer just took a deep breath and continued into their own house, hoping, she wouldn't notice the cuts and piece together the awful truth. The killer's name was Gary Shera, and he was a young man whose only connection to Lisa was that he had been a customer at the gift store where she worked. And so, the police had sort of begun the investigation with this idea that this really couldn't have been a random attack of sorts. But in reality, it sort of was. Police believe that just a few weeks before the murder, Shera had visited the shop just to buy a music box for his wife. Like, that actually was the reason he was going. It was not to scout for a victim. He just went into the store to buy this gift. But when he saw Lisa working there, he sort of immediately became obsessed with her. And then that obsession ultimately turned into murder. In January of 1993, Shera's wife, who was the woman in the other room who called out to him asking where he had been on the night of Lisa's murder, she, the wife, ultimately called in a tip suggesting that her husband might have been involved in this murder. But the police decided the tip was not credible because Shera's wife was, one, an alcoholic, and two, Shera and his wife were in the middle of this heated divorce. And so it seemed like this could be revenge. And then also remember, there were all these other women calling in, basically suggesting their husband was the killer. So this is like one of many, and they had to filter some of them out. This one got filtered out. So ultimately, Shera's name sort of got buried amid the hundreds of other suspects until 25 years later, when police served him a warrant for a DNA sample. He was one of those 11 people who fit the phenotype who had not given a sample. And realizing he was about to get caught, he left his girlfriend a letter confessing to the murder and actually tried to end his own life, but he survived. Following his failed attempt to take his own life, Gary Shera was tracked down at the hospital and arrested on September 16, 2017. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. It was Monday, March 20th, 1995, and Japan's capital city of Tokyo was waking up to a truly beautiful early spring day. By the end of the month, the city's famous cherry blossom trees would be in bloom, attracting thousands of visitors and residents to the cherry blossom festivals that would pop up in half a dozen places throughout what is the largest urban center in the world. But on that particular morning, many of those who worked in Tokyo, like 26-year-old airline employee Kyoka Izumi, were not happy when they heard their alarms going off. The day before had been Sunday, so a day off, and the next day, Tuesday, was also a day off because it was the national holiday celebrating the spring equinox. But that day, Monday, was just a regular work day. And so when Kyoka rolled out of her bed at 6:15 a.m., she felt super annoyed that her employer hadn't just given them the day off to make it a long weekend. To make matters worse, as soon as Kyoka actually got out of bed, she immediately felt sick. Nothing major, but she just felt groggy and a little out of it, and she briefly thought about calling out of work, and considering how uninspired she already felt about working that day, the option sounded like a pretty good one, but ultimately, she decided to suck it up and head in with the rest of her coworkers. After all, Kyoka did like her job. She found working for the airline industry was far more exciting than her previous job was, which had been working for one of Japan's major train companies, Japan Railway. And she figured getting up and moving around might actually make her feel better. So instead of going back to sleep, Kyoka headed for the shower, then she got dressed and downed her usual quick cup of coffee, then she headed out the door and began speedwalking to the closest subway station. Once she got there, she would catch the first of 3 trains that would take her from her home in northwest Tokyo to her office in the southeastern part of Japan's capital. As Kyoka walked, the last of the light purple plum blossoms that always bloomed at the end of February reminded her again of tomorrow's spring holiday. Her spirits lifting, she glanced at the time, and despite getting a slower than usual start that morning, she'd left the house at about 7:50 a.m., she still was on track to get to her office right before the day began at 8:30. A few minutes later, Kyoka got to the entrance of the local train station. She was lucky because the timing of her daily commute meant that she always missed the absolute height of Tokyo's morning rush hour, where the subways would get so crowded with people, subway attendants in uniforms and caps literally pushed people and their bags into the train cars just so the doors could close. But even at its most crowded, and the Tokyo subway carried more than twice as many riders as the New York City subway, Tokyo actually has one of the safest, most efficient subway systems in the world. Walk into a Tokyo subway at any hour of the day, and you will not see people sleeping on benches or warming up on top of heating grates. You won't see trash, you won't see graffiti. It will be pristine. The same subway attendants who push people onto the trains also spend a large amount of their time patrolling the subway to pick up trash and make sure everything is always spotless. Kyoka turned off the sidewalk and headed down the stairs into the less than crowded subway station below. She swiped her train pass and then stepped through the turnstile out onto the train platform. A few minutes later, the first train she would take arrived, and she stepped on board and she grabbed a seat near the doors. The doors shut a few moments later, and off the train went, rumbling into the dark tunnel ahead. 5 stops later, Kyoka stepped off of that train and walked across to the other side of the station platform, where she stood idly waiting to catch the next train. A few minutes later, that train would arrive. It was train A725K, and it pulled into the station right in front of her. This train would take her all the way to Government Center, which is right in the center of Tokyo, and is one of the busiest train stations in all of Japan. When the doors of train A725K opened, Kyoka stepped aboard and once again felt lucky she was missing rush hour because the train, it was crowded, but not so crowded that pushers would be required to get everyone on board. Most of the seats were taken, but Kyoka could see a clearing towards the front of the car where she'd be able to stand. And so as she began walking in that direction, she nodded to a few familiar faces but didn't have any conversations with anyone. Tokyo subway etiquette included never littering, not making any commotion, and not talking too loudly, or really at all. And this morning, that suited Kyoka just fine. She really did not feel like talking anyway. When she reached the clearing in the front of the car, she grabbed onto a handrail above her head, and she watched as the doors closed, and then she felt the train begin to lurch forward. When Kyoka left that morning, she had hoped her morning commute would wake her up and make her feel better, but as she stood there on this second train, A725K, she couldn't help but notice that she actually was starting to feel worse. As this train slowly rumbled on in the darkness, Kyoka closed her eyes and took a deep breath in to try to reduce the nausea that was starting to come on. But as her lungs filled, she suddenly felt this excruciating pain in her chest. It was so blindingly painful and so sudden that she instinctively let go of the handrail and grabbed at her chest with both of her hands, almost causing her to fall over, given the fact that the train was moving. She breathed out forcibly and then gagged as if the air she had just inhaled was the source of the pain, but even with her lungs now empty, her chest still ached. But just as quickly as the pain had started, it stopped. And when it did, she fumbled again for the handrail above her head, and once she had a firm grasp on it and she was steady on her feet, she told herself that, that pain had probably just been connected to stress, as her grandfather had passed away recently, and she was very upset about that, and so she was thinking, okay, that could be why. Or maybe it was connected to her just not feeling very good that morning to begin with. Maybe this is just her being sick. But after she was able to kind of talk herself down and convince herself that this was not a big deal, something else registered to her, which was she had just grabbed at her chest and started gagging, and very obviously it just kind of made this scene. People are going to be staring at her and wondering now if she's okay. And so Kyoka starts to feel super embarrassed as she's still kind of looking down, and she's imagining that when she looks up, there's going to be all these commuters staring at her, waiting to see, is she okay or not? And so Kyoka, eventually, she does look up and she's anticipating kind of like waving to people and kind of signaling that she was okay now. But when she looked up, she was kind of surprised at what she saw. Because when she looked around into the train car, no one was looking at her. And the reason was everyone in the train, everyone was coughing. No one was paying attention to her. All they were doing was trying to cover their mouths as they all coughed. So everyone's got their jackets over their faces and, they have their elbows up over their mouths. And Kyoka's just kind of looking around, wondering what the heck is going on. And then she felt her own throat start to tighten and she started to cough. And as Kyoka tried to shield her own mouth, she noticed the people around her had gone from a somewhat mild cough to a violent one. Some people were coughing so aggressively they could not catch their breath, and you could see panic on their faces as they don't know what to do. They're not able to breathe. But despite this totally insane coughing phenomenon that was taking place on board this train car, the train just rumbled on and continued making all of its scheduled stops. And as new commuters clamored on board, they too began to cough. By the time the train pulled into Government Center, Kyoka's stop, virtually everyone was now violently coughing and keeled over. People had given up trying to shield their mouths at this point. It was just too out of control. And by now, basically everyone had decided they were just going to get off the train, whether Government Center was their stop or not. And so there was a throng of people that were kind of pressed up against the doors, waiting for the doors to open. And so when the train finally did come to a full stop and the doors opened up, a wave of coughing commuters rushed out onto the station platform, the sound of their hacking and gagging filling the air. And so Kyoka, she was towards the back of this group of people leaving the train. And as she was leaving, right as she's about to go out of the train doors, she glances down the length of the train car she is in, and she sees some of the passengers are pointing at something on the ground while yelling for subway attendants to come have a look. But Kyoka, from where she was standing, she couldn't see what they were pointing at, and because she wanted fresh air so badly, she was not about to stay on the train to figure out what it is. And so Kyoka, she gets off of the train, and as soon as she does, even though she is still coughing, as is everybody else around her, her mind is entirely focused on hustling over to the stairs that will bring her downstairs to the final train platform where she will catch the final third train that will bring her on her way to work. Because at this point, even though she has no idea why everybody is coughing, Kyoka is only viewing this coughing fit as a nuisance, not as an emergency. But as Kyoka moved towards these stairs, she suddenly felt extremely nauseous, and she rushed into a nearby women's bathroom in case she needed to throw up. Once she was inside, she resisted the urge to vomit, and then she splashed some water on her face, and then after kind of composing herself, she headed back out onto the station platform, and still her mind is focused on just getting to work. And so she begins walking over to the stairs again. But she'd only gone maybe a few steps before an alarm sounded inside of the subway, and then a voice came over the subway intercom telling everyone to evacuate. Having worked for Japan Railways previously, Kyoka had been educated about this particular alarm that she was hearing. She was told it was never used for anything other than true emergencies, so she knew whatever was going on had to be bad. Right around the time that Kyoka was getting ready to leave for her daily commute to work, 48-year-old Ikuyo Hayashi was also getting ready for work. Hayashi was part of Japan's highly educated and financially successful super elite. He was a gifted and well-respected surgeon who was known for being extremely devoted to his patients. On that particular Monday, like Kyoka, Dr. Hayashi had gotten up early. But shortly after starting his typical morning routine, he noticed he was sweating a little bit and his heart rate was elevated. For a second, he felt concerned, but he chalked it up to stress and kept getting ready. Just before 7:30 a.m., he headed to the front door. Before stepping into the cold morning air, he patted his coat pockets to make sure he had everything. Then, despite the clear forecast for the rest of the day, he grabbed an umbrella leaning up against the front door, and then he stepped outside and made his way to the curb where a car was waiting for him. Dr. Hayashi climbed into the back seat, and then after exchanging hellos with the driver, a 31-year-old named Tomomitsu Nimi, the two men headed for the station, where Dr. Hayashi would catch train A725K. But along the way, they made one stop at a local convenience store. Dr. Hayashi and Nimi got out of the car and went inside. Hayashi put a few odds and ends that he needed on the counter, and Nimi put a couple of newspapers on the counter as well. After Dr. Hayashi had paid for it all, the two men left the store together, they got back into the car, and by 7:48 a.m., Dr. Hayashi was stepping aboard the same compartment of train A725K as Kyoka. After dropping off the doctor and wishing him luck, Nimi had pulled away from the station entrance and headed straight for the train station located just 3 stops further down the line. As soon as he stepped on board train A725K, Dr. Hayashi reached up to adjust the gauze mask he was wearing over his nose and mouth. The mask was a fixture on the Tokyo subway, especially in the cold and flu season when passengers wore them to prevent the spread of germs in the crowded subway compartments. He moved over to an empty seat, and before sitting down, he patted his coat pockets again to make sure he had all of his things. And then as he sat down, he saw sitting across from him was a woman and what appeared to be her young daughter sitting next to her. The woman was looking down, avoiding eye contact, but the young girl was looking up with a smile on her face. She was just too young to realize staring was rude. The doctor smiled back at her, but then quickly looked away. A few seconds later, the doors of the train closed, and the car began rumbling down the tracks. 3 stops later, Dr. Hayashi stood up, but before he got off, he paused for a moment in front of his seat. As he stood there, he noticed the girl was staring at him again. He looked at her, but only for a second. Then, after patting his coat pockets for a 3rd time, he quickly strode out of the train car and onto the station platform. He moved quickly to a nearby trash can and pulled the mask off of his face and disposed of it. Then, forcing himself not to hurry, Dr. Hayashi climbed the steps to the street where Nimi, his driver, was waiting for him by the curb. Immediately after the doctor got off the train, the little girl who had been sitting in front of him noticed a pile of newspapers underneath the seat where the doctor had just been sitting. Even as a youngster, she knew littering was strictly forbidden, and she wondered if the doctor or someone else had left it there. As she stared at this newspaper, she noticed a wet spot starting to form in the center of it, like the paper was sitting on top of a liquid and it was starting to seep through. As she stared, her eyes began to water and then she began to cough. Her mother turned to see if her daughter was okay, but before she could offer the child any help or comfort, she too began to cough. And then, just a few feet away from them at the front of the car, Kyoka felt that sharp shooting pain in her chest and nearly fell over, and then she too started to cough. But despite all of the coughing, the train kept rumbling on, headed for Japan's government center, where 3 major subway lines all converged. And as commuters shuffled on and off of train A725K, they pushed the now soaking wet newspaper aside with the toes of their shoes. They also stepped in what looked like an oily residue around the wet newspapers, tracking it up and down the compartment and out onto the train platforms. When the train finally reached the government center and Kyoka got off along with most of the others, some of the passengers stayed on board to point out the wet newspapers to subway attendants on the platform, hoping they could come clean them up. After getting off of the train, Kyoka felt nauseous and rushed to the bathroom. Right before she walked into the women's room, she passed by 24-year-old subway attendant Masura Yuasa, who had just finished a 24-hour shift and was getting ready to go home. The pair didn't know each other and probably didn't even see each other when they passed, but before the day was over, they would be forever bound by tragedy. Masura really liked his job with the Tokyo Metro, and despite looking like he was still in high school, he actually had worked as a subway attendant for 7 years. As he passed by Kyoka, he heard people coughing on the platform, but it wasn't something that really registered to him. He was only thinking about going home and going to bed because he was exhausted from his overnight shift. As he moved along the platform, he saw his chief suddenly coming out of an office with a mop in his hand. And so, intrigued, Masura asked him, what's up with the mop? And his chief would tell him that there had been some sort of liquid spill on one of the trains, and whatever it was had apparently been tracked all over the train, and now it was out all over the station platform, and so he needed to go and clean it up. Masura didn't actually need to help him. His shift was over, but he told his chief that he'd go along and he'd help out. So Masura and his chief walked together down the platform, and as they walked, they both started to notice that just about every commuter they passed was coughing. But neither Masura nor his chief addressed it, they just kept on walking. Eventually, they saw 3 of their fellow subway attendants straight ahead, standing in the middle of the platform. 2 of the men were holding in their hands the wet newspapers that had been inside train A725K, and a 3rd man who was next to them was opening up a trash bag. And as the 2 men who were holding the newspaper were waiting for this bag to be opened, oily liquid seemed to be pouring off of the newspaper's edges onto the ground. And in fact, there was a long, oily trail on the ground from wherever these papers had been carried from all the way to that platform. And so as soon as Masura and the chief walked up in front of these 3, the chief noticed the huge oily puddle right underneath them, and he saw the trail, and so he got to work trying to mop up this oil all over the ground. And Masura, he didn't really have a job to do. He didn't have a mop, and he didn't have a bag or anything, so he just stood there watching. And as he stood there, it really started to sink in that virtually everyone on the platform now was violently coughing. And some people were even leaned up against the wall vomiting. And so Masura was so confused by what he was seeing, but before he could even ask his coworkers what was going on, his throat started to tighten up. And then right as Masura began coughing, he saw one of his coworkers collapse. It was the older man named Mr. Takahashi. He was the one who had had the plastic bag, which was now full of the wet newspapers. And right as Mr. Takahashi fell, to Masura, it felt like all hell had suddenly broken loose. He and the others who were around Mr. Takahashi rushed over to him to see if they could help him, and right as they're standing over him, loosening his tie and asking him if he is okay, the alarm goes off and the call over the intercom to evacuate comes out. Masura was just in shock, and for a second he just stood there frozen. But then he shook himself out of it and he ran for a phone on the wall that the subway staff would use. And he pushed the button that would call to the office that was upstairs, and when somebody picked up on the other line, Masura had to yell because of the alarm and all the coughing people and people screaming and panicking all around him. And so Masura was able to yell out into the phone that someone needed to bring a stretcher down to the platform he was on for Mr. Takahashi, who has collapsed, and someone needs to call an ambulance for Mr. Takahashi. And so after Masura communicates this over the phone, he hangs up and he runs back over to the crowd of his coworkers and Mr. Takahashi. And then just a minute later, a subway attendant comes charging down the stairs. He's got a stretcher in hand, and he, along with Masura and the other coworkers, they put Mr. Takahashi on this stretcher and they lift him up and they begin carefully moving him through this very panicked throng of commuters trying to evacuate that are coughing and vomiting. And so as they're moving, Masura, who's holding onto the stretcher, he turns back and he yells at the man who had come down with the stretcher. He says to him, "Hey, you called the ambulance. Where are they going to meet us?" Because upstairs, there were several exits out of Government Center. And so unless the ambulance knew where to pick them up, it would be nearly impossible to sync up with them. And so Masura's looking back at this coworker of his, waiting for an answer, but this coworker is staring at Masura with his eyes wide, totally glazed over. And then suddenly this guy just collapses to the ground. He lets go of the stretcher and falls to the ground and starts convulsing and shaking. And so Masura and the others put Mr. Takahashi down to deal with this new casualty. And as they did, Masura's chief, as well as the other two men who had been holding the newspapers, they begin to uncontrollably vomit. And so suddenly Masura is the only one who is not violently ill or in some way hurt. And so even though he had no idea what was going on and it's absolute chaos all around him, he did know he had to act right now. And so he yelled at this group he was with, who probably didn't even hear him, that he was going to go upstairs, he was going to find this ambulance and figure out what exit they needed to bring Mr. Takahashi to. And then he turned and began trying to run up the stairs as fast as he could, even though he was totally surrounded by panicked commuters trying to get out as well. But eventually he got to the top of the stairs, at which point he ran through the crowd toward the nearest doors that would bring him outside. And as soon as he pushed the doors open, he couldn't believe what he saw. There were people outside on the ground everywhere. People were coughing and vomiting, and he could hear sirens, ambulance sirens everywhere. But there was no ambulance outside waiting for Mr. Takahashi. And so he's thinking to himself, how is this ambulance not here? Where are these other ambulances going? What is going on? And so Masura couldn't help but think something really bad was happening across his city. And so he stood there for a minute wondering what he should do, and then he just decided, I have to go back down and just get Mr. Takahashi up here. We'll find the ambulance, but I gotta get him up here. And so even though he was starting to feel very sick, very nauseous, he turns and just charges back into the station. Below ground, Kyoka was coming to the same realization that something very bad must be happening to them. When she left the bathroom and began running up the stairs to the street after the alarm went off, she had looked behind her at some point, and through the sea of people, she could clearly see bodies lying on the ground, on the platform, and on the stairs. And as she ran, people to her left and to her right were crumpling to the ground, vomiting and convulsing. Finally, she managed to get upstairs and she ran toward the same exit doors that Masura had just gone through moments before her. And when she looked outside, her mind froze. The streets looked like a battlefield. People were violently convulsing on the sidewalk. There were people with spoons in their mouths, which she would later learn was to keep them from swallowing their tongues. She also saw men in business suits lying in flower beds, staring straight up into the sky without blinking. One elderly man was foaming at the mouth. And so as she stood there shocked, Masura, along with the other very sick subway attendants, they had rallied their strength and lifted Mr. Takahashi up on his stretcher, and they had brought him upstairs, and so they came barging out the doors right next to her, and then they placed Mr. Takahashi down kind of right in front of Kyoka. And Kyoka, she doesn't know who these people are, but she found herself just staring at them, and she watched as Masura ran up right next to Mr. Takahashi, and he was holding his hand, and he's kind of crying and trying to talk to Mr. Takahashi, and Masura is yelling out for someone to help him find an ambulance. And so Kyoka, she's kind of in shock and she's just staring at everything going on, not sure what to do. But then she kind of snaps out of it and she hears Masura and she decides, okay, I'm going to help him find an ambulance. And so she yells to Masura that she's going to go find his ambulance. And so she runs all the way down to the street, which was not far from the exit of the subway station. And when she was in the road, she heard the sirens everywhere. They were all over Tokyo, but there were none near them. But Kyoka noticed there was this news van that had just pulled up and all these news people had hopped out and they had their cameras up and they're filming the exits of the subway station. And Kyoka just suddenly felt furious and she screamed at them to stop filming, help us. And so the news crew, they kind of sensed the gravity of the situation, even though they really had no idea what was going on. And they said to Kyoka, what can we do? And she said, stay right there. You're going to drive someone to the hospital. And then Kyoka ran back to Masura and she got him and his coworkers to lift up Mr. Takahashi. And they went down to the news van and they loaded Mr. Takahashi into the back of the news van. And Kyoka would give Masura her handkerchief. And she says, look, hang this out the window and wave it the whole time. They're going to drive you to the hospital. People will see you waving that and they will know it's an emergency. And so Masura thanked her and he and all of his coworkers hopped in the van with the news crew and they headed off. Mr. Takahashi would unfortunately die before they reached the hospital. By now, it was obvious to basically everyone in Tokyo that something horrible had happened inside of the subway, but nobody knew what it was. However, when the truth was finally uncovered, people had a very hard time believing it. Earlier that morning, just before Dr. Hayashi got off of train A725K, he stood up in front of his seat and momentarily paused. As he stood there, he acted like he was patting his coat down one more time to make sure he had all of his belongings, but he wasn't really doing that. He was using that innocent-seeming gesture to shake loose a folded-up newspaper that was inside of his jacket. It was the same newspaper that his driver had purchased at the convenience store with him that morning. And once it was loose, it fell from the inside of his jacket down onto the ground right next to Dr. Hayashi's right foot. And Dr. Hayashi, he acted like he didn't know he had just done that. He kind of ignored the newspaper on the ground. The only person on the train who seemed to be paying any attention to him was the little girl who was sitting in front of him. As he stood, Dr. Hayashi looked at her, but only for a moment before he looked away. Then he carefully, but forcefully, pushed the sharpened tip of his umbrella straight down into the newspaper that he had just dropped. He did this several times without looking down before finally hustling off the train. Wrapped up inside of the newspaper he dropped were two identical plastic packets that almost resembled dishwasher soap pods. Inside of these packets was a liquid form of one of the most deadly nerve toxins in the world, sarin gas. And when Dr. Hayashi jabbed his umbrella into the newspaper, he was attempting to puncture those packets because as soon as that liquid was exposed to the air, it would vaporize and become sarin gas. He was only able to puncture one of the two packets, but that was more than enough. Developed by the Nazis in 1937, sarin is among the most toxic of any known chemical warfare agent. Within seconds of exposure, sarin disrupts the normal activity of our neurotransmitters, basically sending our nervous system into overdrive. Your muscles start to convulse and twitch. Your normal bodily secretions go crazy, so you start to cough and you can't stop. Tears come pouring out of your eyes. Your pupils contract until they're like pinpoints. Your nose starts running. You drool and vomit. As neurotransmitters keep telling your nerves to go, 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 your bowels and bladder evacuate themselves. And because sarin has no taste or smell, the people near it in the Tokyo subway had absolutely no idea what was happening to them. Instead, they felt the stabbing pain as their chest tightened. They started to feel nauseous, their vision blurred. Depending on the purity and strength of the sarin gas and the type of exposure, those symptoms could intensify, progressing to convulsions, paralysis, and death within 1 to 10 minutes. After fleeing the train and making it back to street level, Dr. Hayashi quickly got into the waiting car with Nimi, his driver, and the pair started driving west. Their next destination was a large swath of desolate land located near the foot of Mount Fuji, an active volcano about 65 miles outside of Tokyo. As soon as the car broke free of Tokyo traffic, Nimi started to speed up. Soon they both had a clear view of Mount Fuji, its peak covered in snow, and then about an hour later, the men had arrived at their destination. They pulled up to a collection of run-down-looking buildings surrounded by a high chain-link fence. As soon as Nimi had parked the car inside of the compound, Dr. Hayashi opened the car door and walked toward one of these smaller buildings. Once inside, he walked straight through what looked like a waiting room to a back door. He took a deep breath and then he opened that door, and inside was this smaller office, and there were 8 men inside of it. Dr. Hayashi stepped inside with Nimi close behind him, and they took up their spot on the right side of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder with the other men, and just like everyone else, they waited in silence. A few minutes later, the door at the back of this inner office opened, and a 40-year-old man named Shoko Asahara came in. He was a stocky man with black hair down to his shoulders, and he had a black beard that reached halfway down his chest. When he stopped in front of Dr. Hayashi, Nimi, and the other 8 assembled men, he stared at them through his gray eyes. After a few tense moments, a man standing next to Dr. Hayashi nervously stepped forward, and he looked at Shoko, and he just said, "Mission accomplished." It would turn out Dr. Hayashi and every other person in that room, and nearly 50,000 other people at the time, were part of a doomsday cult called Om Shinrikyo, which means Supreme Truth, and Shoko was their leader. Initially, Shoko had founded Om Shinrikyo to preach a mashup of Hinduism, Buddhism, meditation, and natural healing, and he was extremely good at recruiting people to join, attracting many members of Japan's super elite like Dr. Hayashi. And once people joined, it was like they fell under Shoko's spell. and soon they would become obsessed with him, doing things like drinking his bathwater to try to get closer to him, or wearing electrically charged hats they believed would synchronize their thoughts with his. And so when Shoko shifted gears and decided Aum Shinrikyo needed to focus less on spirituality and healing, and instead focus on starting World War III in order to cleanse the world, none of his extremely well-educated followers, like Dr. Hayashi, objected. Instead, they said, "How can we help?" And so, on March 20th, 1995, Dr. Hayashi, along with 4 other cult members that were in that room with him, carried sarin gas packets into the Tokyo subway and dropped and punctured them in strategic locations to ensure the gas spread as far as possible. And then afterwards, they ran back to the streets where their drivers were waiting to take them away. And all of the drivers were in this room as well. Shoko hoped this attack would somehow prompt World War III and collapse the Japanese government, but it didn't do that. However, it did kill 13 people and injured 5,000 people. Amazingly, this was not the first sarin gas attack carried out by this cult. A year earlier, Shoko had orchestrated another sarin attack on a quiet Japanese neighborhood that killed 8 people and injured more than 300, but at the time, no one knew the cult was responsible. On May 16, 1995, so nearly 1 month after the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway, authorities would figure out the previous attack was carried out by Shoko and his cult, and this one was carried out by them as well. And so they would track down and arrest Shoko Asahara. He was discovered in a secret compartment between the 2nd and 3rd floors of the Mount Fuji headquarters. He was dressed in purple robes and meditating at the time of his arrest. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, police would track down and charge 200 cult members in connection with the subway attack and in connection with other crimes and murders. Dr. Hayashi, whose sarin packets were directly responsible for 2 deaths, along with hundreds of injuries, cooperated with the police, giving up information about the cult. In exchange for this information, he was spared the death penalty and given life in prison. 123 cult members would be given the death penalty, including Dr. Hayashi's driver, Nimi, and the cult's leader, Shoko Asahara. Kyoka and Masura would both survive the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. Masura would spend 3 days in the hospital, but after he was discharged, he would go right back to work. And Kyoka, she initially did not go to the hospital, sticking around to help people as much as she could. But later that day, she would get very, very sick, and she would stay that way for several weeks, but she would eventually make a full recovery. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. In 2011, Heike Dorsch and her boyfriend Stefan Rahman were living their best life sailing southwest from the Galapagos Islands. For the last 3 years, they had abandoned their lives in the city and had moved on to Stefan's catamaran and were just sailing the globe. On August 30th, 2011, after a particular stretch where they had been at sea for 17 days consecutively without seeing land anywhere, Heike was laying down on the catamaran catching some sun when she heard Stefan yell out, "Land!" And she looked up and she saw these mountainous islands kind of coming into view just over the horizon. These were the 15 islands that make up the Marquesas Island range within French Polynesia. Heike remembers not being able to control her grin. It was like she couldn't stop smiling because it really looked like paradise, and she was so excited to land there. The Marquesas Island range were not big tourist attractions because of how mountainous and rocky they were, and the water was not that beautiful Kool-Aid blue that people expect out of French Polynesia. But for Heike and Stefan, this was perfect. They were not looking for mass market tourism. They were looking for authentic cultural contact. And it would turn out that the Marquesas Island range was perfect for this because the locals just weren't used to seeing tourists. And so before long, the locals were embracing Heike and Stefan and bringing them down to the beach for their cookouts and going spearfishing with them. And even one night they were invited into a local's home where they got to be a part of a big family dinner. After 6 weeks, Heike and Stefan had explored the majority of the Marquesas Island range, but there was still one of the 15 islands that they had not yet explored called Nuku Haiba. And so on the day before they planned to leave the island range, they decided to go check it out. When they dropped anchor in the bay that sat just outside of this island, there were no boats, There were no fishermen, there were no people, there was nothing. It was like a deserted island. And so they make their way on the beach and they see there's this trail that goes inland. Being explorers, they couldn't help themselves but walk down the trail to see what's down there. After 15 minutes of walking down this jungle path, they come to a clearing, and in this clearing is this very strange looking village that's made up of all these shacks. They can't tell if people live there or have lived there recently, because to them, it just looks totally abandoned. And as they're kind of looking around, they notice way down the path beyond these shacks is one man standing in the middle of the road. He's this really big guy with his shirt off, standing next to a horse, and he's just looking directly at them. He's not waving to them, he's not signaling to them, he's just watching them. And it kind of creeped them out at first, but they decided that the polite thing to do would be to go over and talk to him, because this is probably his village and they were the trespassers. So they go over to this guy and they introduce themselves, and he says that his name is Arihano and that he lives in this village. Through broken French, they're able to have a semi-normal conversation, which seemed like pleasantries. And at some point, Stefan, just off the cuff, asked this guy if he'd be willing to be his guide on a hunt. He wanted to go hunting for goats, which is something that everybody did on the Marquesas Island, and Stefan really wanted to be a part of that. And Arihano says, sure, I'll be your guide. Heike was a little bit caught off guard, but wasn't surprised because Stefan had been talking endlessly about how he wanted to go on a goat hunt before they left the Marquesas Island range. But she didn't feel like doing this, so she said, you two go, I'll meet you over at the boat. So Heike turns around and starts walking down the jungle path back towards their boat, and she turns around one more time and she sees Stefan and Arihano walking into the jungle down another path, and they disappear. Heike spent the next several hours just laying out on the beach waiting for Stefan to return, but after quite a while and she hadn't heard anything, she started to get a little bit worried. And as she's starting to get worried, she hears someone yelling out on the water, and from around the corner, Arihano comes around on his boat and he's waving to her and he's yelling for her in French that there's been an accident, that Stefan's been hurt and she needs to come with him. Without another thought, Heike runs into the water, jumps into Arihano's dinghy, and the two of them drive back around the corner to wherever Arihano and Stefan had been. They land at this little tiny beach that's right up against a jungle, and immediately Heike jumps out, runs right into the jungle, and she's yelling for Stefan, and there's no sign of him. He's not yelling back. She has no idea where to look, and she kept turning around and asking Arihano, where is he? What happened to him? And Arihano just wasn't really giving her a good answer. He was just being quiet. Frustrated, Heike walks even farther into the jungle. She's yelling even louder, and still there's nothing. And so she turns around to confront Arihano and be like, where is Stefan? What's going on? And as soon as she does, she's met with a gun right in her face. Heike immediately grabbed the barrel and tried to fight it away from him, and she could tell that he tried to fire the gun, but the safety was on, and so nothing fired. They kind of struggled with the gun, and at some point he got on top of her and just restrained her and tied her up to a tree. And then he just walked away into the jungle without saying anything. And so Heike is expecting at any moment for him to return and kill her. And she even said that she wished he had just shot her then and there, because the anxiety of waiting for whatever was going to happen was way worse. While Arihano was gone, Heike struggled to try to get the ropes off of her and the rope around her neck off of her, but she couldn't do it. And as she's sitting there struggling, Arihano would return and he would beat her up a little bit before ultimately turning around and leaving once again. Arihano would come back a couple hours later after it had gotten dark, and she's still there struggling to get these ropes off of her, and he would hit her a couple times before leaving again. But when he hit her, he actually managed to loosen some of her restraints, and as soon as he did walk off into the jungle that second time, she was able to get the restraints off of her wrist and her neck. Now, she had no idea where Arihano was, but as soon as she took one step, she saw a flashlight maybe a couple hundred meters away flip towards her, and she knew it was Arihano. He had heard her move. And so Heike just starts running full speed. She's stepping on thorns. She's getting slashed by all the undergrowth. She doesn't care. She is running for her life. And because it was a full moon, she could actually see the water because the beach was right next to where she was being held. And so she just ran for the water, and when she got onto the beach, she could see there was another boat out in the water near where theirs had been anchored. And when she looks at the beach, she can see that Arihano must have turned around, because she can see a flashlight kind of bobbing its way farther and farther deeper into the jungle. Using the couple's satellite phone, Heike was able to alert authorities, who launched a search for Stefan, and initially they couldn't find him and they couldn't find Arihano. But 3 days into the search, they made a grisly discovery. The Marquesan Islands are actually known for the Marquesan warriors that used to inhabit these islands up until the 12th century, and they were known for being the most aggressive cannibals in the South Pacific. In particular, the island of Nuku Hiva, which is where Stefan had just gone missing and where Heike had just been attacked by Arihano. But historians believe nobody on Marquesas has practiced cannibalism since the 12th century. That practice has gone away. Well, until 2011, when Arellano, who was in fact a Marquesas warrior, met Stefan and decided that now is a good time to bring that practice back. Right after Heike had turned around and walked back to the beach and Stefan and Arellano had gone on their hunt, Arellano had attacked Stefan, tied him up, and described seeing his neck pulsing with fear as Arellano built this massive campfire that authorities said was 3 times bigger than any campfire they'd ever come across. And then Arellano shot him and put him in the fire. Although Arellano would be captured and convicted of killing Stefan, Arellano would never actually come out and say that he had in fact eaten portions of Stefan, and it was impossible to tell from his remains how much had been consumed versus burned off in the fire. But virtually anybody who was involved in this case has their suspicions that Arellano had ritualistically cannibalized Stefan. In the early morning hours of February 6, 2014, a van carrying 5 men finally came to a stop outside of a farm in Norway. After a miserable, nearly 15-hour drive, these 5 men who were from Finland were finally ready to begin their real adventure. They were going to be attempting one of the most dangerous underwater dives in the world. It is called the Traverse, and it is a 2-kilometer subsurface dive from one entrance of the Plura Cave to the other. The entrance they were going to start in was inside of the frozen pond next to this farm. 2 of the 5 men had actually done this so-called Traverse before because they were the ones that discovered these 2 entrances were actually connected. But no amount of experience was going to limit the amount of physical risk they would have to take in order to complete this dive. The dive was so long, over 2 kilometers, that you actually needed a specialized underwater scooter that could propel you through the tunnel because you wouldn't be able to swim fast enough before you ran out of air. Which also meant if your scooter broke down in the middle of this pitch black underwater cave, you were screwed. The majority of the dive was going to be through this really tight tunnel where all along the ground were these limestone rocks that kind of poked up, where if you weren't careful, if you dragged your dry suit along them, you could tear it open. And then freezing water would go into your dry suit and you would die. Also, they were going to be using a diving rig known as a rebreather. So as a Navy SEAL, we used rebreathers. Basically, it takes your air and rebreathes it. So you're not breathing air into the water, you're breathing out into the system that scrubs your CO2 and then pumps it back into you. And you also combine that rebreathed air with pure oxygen, so you have a continuous cycle where you're just breathing pure oxygen. It makes for a really cool dive because you're looking around and there's no bubbles. But it's also very dangerous, and your body doesn't really adjust well to having pure oxygen pumped into it. In fact, you can be poisoned from pure oxygen, and when you're diving at depth with a rebreather, on the way up, you can't just rocket to the surface. There are these things called decompression stops along the way up, where depending on how long you were at a certain depth, you need to wait at certain stops along the way back up to the surface and let your body decompress. If you don't do that and you just rush to the surface, you can get something called the bends, which is decompression sickness, and it can be fatal. Not to mention, there's a couple other nasty side effects of using a rebreather, like if you get water inside of your breathing loop, it can actually get into the CO2 absorbent that sits inside of your rig, and that can cause this acidic mixture to go back into your mouth. But you can't take the mouthpiece out because more water will get into it and it'll flood your rig and then you'll just drown. So you need to just accept that there could be acid in your mouth, and you need to either get somebody else to give you their mouthpiece or get a standby rig and breathe off of that, because there's no solution to this. You just got to have acid in your mouth. Also, if you panic for any reason on a rebreather, you'll be breathing really heavy and your system will not be able to scrub the CO2 fast enough, and you'll have a buildup of CO2 in your body and you'll get hypercapnia, which can lead to disorientation and even passing out, which can be lethal underwater. This dive was famously dangerous to the point where the best divers in the world wouldn't attempt it. They called it a death wish. But these 5 divers from Finland were determined, and they were eager to make the traverse. So shortly after they arrived, they take a quick nap, and then they get up and they're ready to start the dive. They decided to break up into 2 groups. They had a pair that was going to go down first, and then 2 hours later, the other 3 would follow. Once the first pair was in the water, there would be no way to communicate between the 2 groups. So the pair cuts a triangle into the ice with a chainsaw, they hop into the beautifully clear water, and very quickly they start descending going down into this tunnel. Once they got down to the tunnel, they turned on their scooters and started heading out. After a couple of hours, the pair reached the most dangerous part of the dive, where the tunnel basically nosedives and goes straight down to about 130 meters. And as you're going down, you have to be very cautious that you're going the right way, because there's all these dead end tunnels that look exactly like the way you're supposed to go, and they go pretty far out. But if you were to accidentally take a wrong turn and go down one of these dead man turns, you wouldn't have enough oxygen to complete the dive. So it's a slow process of making sure you go down the exact right path. And then when you get to the bottom at 130 meters, there was this plate that had been left there to signify you've gone the right way. And then you turn and go right back up again, and you're pretty much at the exit at that point. But it takes quite a while to cover that last little bit, because there are necessary decompression stops along the way. The first group descended with no issues and didn't get sidetracked. They got to the bottom where that plate was. They turned and began going back up the ascent to their first decompression stop. The lead diver got through a particularly tight spot and then noticed that his partner behind him, his flashlight, which was normally right up against him, he couldn't see it anymore. And he turned and he saw that his partner had gotten wedged in this one section of the ascent. So the lead diver turns around and swims down to the trapped diver, who he can tell is panicking a little bit because he's trying to get himself free and he can't move. And the lead diver looks and he can tell that he is thoroughly wedged into this one little section. And the lead diver would say that what he thought happened is the trap diver must have been going too quickly with his scooter and basically motorized himself into this wedge. Like, it wouldn't have been humanly possible to swim fast or hard enough to get stuck as badly as he did. The lead diver could tell that he was totally stuck. There was probably no way he was going to get out of this. And so he tried taking some of his gear off, but they have such little space to work with, and the trap diver is starting to sense that this isn't going very well. And in a panic, he accidentally knocks his mouthpiece out of his mouth and can't find it again, and ends up inhaling a bunch of water, and he dies. The lead diver knows that he can't panic because he will end up burning through his oxygen. He'll probably get hypercapnia. He won't be able to get to the surface, and he'll die too. So he tries to free his friend's body and he can't. And he's now realizing that the second set of divers that are coming in the tunnel, they're going to get to this point in the dive, which is very far into the dive, and they won't be able to get past his dead body. And they'll have to turn around, but they don't have enough oxygen, he didn't think, to make it back to the surface. And so almost certainly those three divers are going to get here and be trapped and are going to die too. And so, terrified and devastated and saddened by what's ultimately going to happen, he turns and starts heading for the surface. And he had to stop at each of those decompression stops. And you can only imagine what it was like to be sitting inside of this tight tunnel waiting for 30 minutes and 45 minutes at the different decompression stops, just thinking about what's inevitably going to happen beyond the dead body. They're going to get trapped. They're going to die. He's going to be the only one that gets out of here alive. And at some point he makes it up to the surface and he just sits there and waits. Meanwhile, the second set of divers did enter the water 2 hours later. They go down to the tunnel, they're making their way out, and they were farther spread out than the pair was. And so the first diver, the lead diver of the second group, he reached the dead body first before the other two had even seen it or knew about it, and he began to panic. And as the second and third diver come up and realize what's happening, they see the lead diver lose his mouthpiece, and in a panic, he's moving around like this, and he inhales water and also drowns. And so now the second and third diver are dealing with the fact that they just watched their friend die right in front of them. Their other friend from the first group is dead and blocking their way. And the second and third diver, they also begin to panic. They don't communicate, and one of them just immediately turns and starts kicking it out back towards the entrance, knowing full well they probably don't have enough oxygen to get there. The other diver decided they were going to find a way to get past the dead body that was wedged in the only way up to the surface. And so on their own, over a kilometer underwater in this tight little tunnel where they're totally trapped, they're relying on a flashlight for light. There's two dead bodies. This second diver begins removing pieces of their gear and pushing it through the little space between the dead body and the clearing that he wanted to get to make his way up to the surface. And after pushing through all of his gear, including his tank, which is a big commitment, because once it was through, he would have to go to the other side. He couldn't get it back through, and push himself through painstakingly with his hands all the way through this tiny little space that he could just barely get through. And then he puts his gear back on, and then knowing he had almost no oxygen left, he had to basically rocket to the surface and just hope decompression sickness didn't kill him. The other diver, who had turned around and gone all the way back to the entrance, they skipped all of their decompression stops as well. They got to the entrance just barely, but when they got there, the entrance was frozen over, and they had to punch their way through the ice, which they were able to do, and they too got on surface once again. The 3 survivors linked up, they called authorities, they went to the hospital, they would make a full recovery. They told authorities where their friends were in this cave, but no one had the ability to get down and retrieve their body. So they sealed off both entrances to this cave and called it a gravesite and said no one can go down there. But months later, the 3 survivors had such intense survivor's guilt that they would actually illegally go back to Plura Cave and retrieve their bodies. In the 1930s, notorious dictator Joseph Stalin began deporting people that he viewed as threats to the regime. Now, at first, that was just political opponents, and he rounded up thousands of those, but over time, Stalin just started rounding up anybody he didn't like. And so as more and more people were deported, Stalin needed a place to put them. The option he settled on was sending these people to Siberia, because it was thousands of miles away from civilization, and the way he saw it is they wouldn't be a threat to the regime anymore because they'd be too busy just trying to survive. Eventually, millions of people were deported to Siberia to fend for themselves, and many people died in the process. But the worst fate of anybody deported to Siberia has to be the roughly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island off the western side of Siberia. In May of 1933, the first 5,000 deportees that would be sent to Nazino Island arrived on its shores. Now, they had been packed inside of barges. Many of them were weak or sick, and so disease quickly spread, and just by the time they arrived, 27 people had already died just in transit. As the survivors disembark onto this snowy island, they see immediately that there's nothing on it. It's this tiny little island. There's no shelter. There's no food. There's no tools. There's no way to make shelter. They're just totally stranded. Their Soviet guards had promised them a ration of flour, but for the first 4 days, they refused to give it to them, and another 295 people died. And to make matters worse, after a couple of days, another almost 2,000 people were shipped out to this island. And so by the time the guards actually took their boats into shore to give the flour to these people, they were starving to death, and they rushed the boats to try to steal the flour, and the guards began shooting at them, took the flour, and went back out to the water. The next day, they came back in to try to give them the flour, and the same thing happened. And so they went back out to the water, and they orchestrated this plan where for every 150 prisoners, there would be a brigadier. And that brigadier would be in charge of coming out and getting the flour and then bringing it back to those 150. But the brigadiers were all criminals, and they would come out, take the flour, and then not distribute it. And so no one got any flour, so no one could eat anything. And the people who did get flour rations mixed it with water, and then they would eat that raw, and it gave them dysentery, and then they died. Totally desperate, these deportees began constructing these crude rafts and began trying to cross the river to the other side, but many of them broke apart and they would drown in the freezing waters. And if they didn't drown, the guards would see them crossing and would take shots at them. And so if they didn't drown or get shot and they did make it to the other side, they'd be in the Siberian wasteland with no supplies, and they would die there too. And so Nazino Island completely devolved into chaos. Almost immediately, cannibalism became a thing, and there were these roving gangs of people that were the strongest and fittest of the island who would just go around and murder the weak and eat them. And the guards that were watching this did nothing to stop it, and frankly couldn't if they wanted to, because you've now reached the absolute extremes of human survival. One local woman who would make an annual trip to Nazino Island before there were people being deported there made her annual trip and was shocked to see all these people on this island that normally had no one there. And she said from her boat, she watched this group of people run up on this woman, drag her to a tree, they tied her to the tree, and then began cutting off pieces of her while she was alive and eating it right in front of her. And then after the group had left, the woman who was tied to the tree was still alive, and what looked like her partner, her boyfriend, her husband comes over, tries to untie her, he tries to save her, but there's nothing he can do, and she dies in his arms. Another local who managed to save a woman from Nazino Island, she got her into her house and she sat her down, and she noticed that the backs of her legs were all bandaged up. And she asked her what was going on with the backs of her legs, and she undid her dressing, and her calf muscles on her legs were gone. Someone had cut them off and eaten them. Of the nearly 7,000 people that were sent to Nazino Island, only 2,000 remained at the end of the first month they were there. And in fact, when word got out to Stalin that this island had become Cannibal Island, he actually shut it down and moved the remaining 2,000 deportees to another labor camp where unfortunately many of them died as well. And sadly, those few thousand people only represent a fraction of the massive number of people that died during Stalin's many purges. So that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed. In the early 1990s, a man turns on his camera, flips on his light, and starts filming. As the viewer, all we can tell is that he's in this gray hallway. It's very unclear where he is. It does appear to be something that might be underground because everything seems to be concrete. As he's filming, he begins walking down this narrow corridor where there's nothing on the walls or on the ground or anywhere to give away where he is. And so for the first 40 seconds of him just walking down this kind of meandering hallway, it's very uneventful. Then at some point, he aims his camera at what looks like an arrow that's been spray painted on the wall. He looks down at the ground and there's another arrow. He starts to follow the arrows and he's filming each one as he comes across them as he goes farther and farther off of the main hallway. And at some point the arrows bring him to this room, which at first you can't tell what it is. But then as the camera focuses, you see that there is this massive pile of human remains, skeletal remains. The guy filming does not seem alarmed by what he's seeing. In fact, it seems like he came here knowing he might come across this room full of human remains. After staring at this room for a few moments, he doesn't go in, but instead turns and continues following these arrows and strange markings on the wall and the ground as it brings him farther and farther down this other corridor to more rooms with more skeletal remains. And at some point, he comes to a full stop and he's looking at one of these rooms and something spooks him. It's unclear what it is because to this point, he's been very nonchalant about this horrible thing he's looking at. It didn't seem to faze him at all, but something did spook him because he's standing there and then all of a sudden he starts sprinting down the hall. Now, it's clear at this point in the video that he is alone down here, or at least he thinks he's alone down here, but he's running as if someone's chasing him. And he just takes off down this hall. The camera is now dropped to his side. He's not even trying to film what's in front of him. You hear his breathing and it's very panicked. And at some point he kind of trips and drops his camera and the camera comes to rest in this puddle looking right up against the wall. So you don't have a clear view of where this guy is or what's going on. And all you hear is his panicked breathing and his rapid footsteps as he continues to run down the hallway and eventually just disappears and it's totally silent. And at some point the camera runs out of batteries and it turns off. 10 years later, a group of urban explorers would find this man's camera where he had dropped it 10 years earlier in one of the scariest places on Earth. Hundreds of feet below the streets of Paris, France, lies one of the world's largest mass graves. It's known as the Paris Catacombs, and it's about 200 miles of intricate passageways that loop all over the city of Paris, where over 6 million people have been buried. The reason all these people were buried down there is because by the 17th century in Paris, the cemeteries in the city were overflowing, and so the decision was made to move their bodies down underneath the streets of Paris into these tunnels that were built in the 13th century for mining but had not been used in hundreds of years. And so they began packing in all these people to the tune of 6 million bodies before they ultimately stopped doing that. Starting in the late 1800s, the catacombs became sort of a popular tourist destination, but only a tiny section of the catacombs was made open to the public, meaning there are literally hundreds of miles of passageways in the catacombs that are totally sealed off to the public. No one goes in there, even though many people believe in these forbidden sections of the catacombs, there are entrances to additional levels of the catacombs, that there could be as much as 400 miles of passageways in the catacombs just waiting to be explored, but no one's allowed to go in there, at least not legally. There is an entire community of people that are sneaking into the forbidden section of the catacombs by going through sewer drains and getting onto train tracks and sneaking into these little cracks in the side of the walls. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous. It involves wriggling your way into these 13th century tunnels that are unmapped, pitch black, and no one knows you're there. Not to mention, you're surrounded by literally millions of dead people. Once people started figuring out how to sneak into the forbidden section of the catacombs, there's been countless stories of these urban explorers sneaking in, getting lost, and never coming out again. Which is exactly what we think happened to the guy with the camera who saw the arrows and then ran away. His camera was located miles and miles into one of those forbidden sections. In 2014, Kenny Veach was an avid long-distance hiker that spent lots of his time hiking around the Mojave Desert in search of caves and abandoned mine shafts to go check out. Sometimes he'd bring his girlfriend with him, but most of the time he was on his own and he would stay out for a couple of days at a time. Kenny was constantly on YouTube watching hiking videos and anything to do with the Mojave Desert. And Kenny was a regular commenter on all of those types of videos. In June of 2014, Kenny must have watched this video called Son of an Area 51 Technician because he had left this comment where he was telling the community that had watched this video that he had had a very strange thing happen to him when he was out hiking near Area 51. For those that don't know what Area 51 is, it's a highly confidential United States Air Force installation that is frequently looped into alien conspiracy theories. Kenny goes on to describe this strange event, and he said he found this cave entrance on the side of this mountain that was shaped like an uppercase M. As Kenny walks up to enter this M-shaped cave, he said his body started to vibrate and it stopped him in his tracks. And he said he didn't know what it was, but as he walked closer and closer, his body just continued to vibrate to the point where he said he just had to turn around and leave, that he knew something was wrong with this cave and he could not go inside. And so he said he turned around and he left. His comment got a lot of traction on this video, and a lot of people jumped on and were like, well, I don't really believe you, one, but if that is true, you gotta go back. You gotta go back there and explore it. You gotta document this. Whatever this is, we want to know what it is. They were basically egging him on to go back and check it out. Kenny responded to his critics and said, I'm telling you the truth. I know what I saw. This cave was different. I go out in the desert all the time looking for caves, and I go in them. That's what I do. This one was different, and that's why I didn't go in it. But people just kept egging him on to go back and check it out and to film it, show documentation of this thing. And so finally he agrees. A couple of months later, Kenny goes back out to the Mojave Desert with his camera and he films himself looking for the M cave, but he can't find it. So the video's kind of a bust. He still uploads it to YouTube and he tells everyone that he's gonna go back out again. He knows where it is. He's fairly confident that he can get to it again, but he just needs to go out a third time to go look for it. Over the course of the next month, in the comment section of that video, people are encouraging Kenny and saying, go out there, go find it, we're so excited. One commenter was not so encouraging. Their name was Lemmy Killmeister, and they wrote on his video, do not go to M Cave. If you go in, you won't be able to get out again. Kenny wrote back, what do you mean? And Lemmy Killmeister didn't respond and subsequently vanished from YouTube. Kenny brushes this off, and on November 10th, 2014, he heads back out once again to try to find M Cave. On November 14th, when he had not returned and his girlfriend had not heard from him and couldn't get in touch with him, she called the police. The police launched this massive search for Kenny. They knew roughly where he was going to be because he had documented it so aggressively on his YouTube channel, and so they search in that area, and after about a week they find his cell phone, and it was laying outside of an abandoned mine shaft. Now immediately searchers think, well, he must have fallen into this mine shaft that was almost a vertical mine shaft. He must have fallen in there to his death. So they get a camera and they feed it down into this mine shaft, and there's no one in there. And very clearly, no one had been down this mine shaft in a very long time. Certainly not Kenny. There were no tracks around where his phone was located, so no animal tracks or people tracks. And the phone didn't have blood on it or scratches on it. It was just sitting there with no new information. Beyond the cell phone, they had nothing else to go on, and eventually the search was terminated. Kenny never turned up. He was just gone after that. While it's pretty easy for people to chalk up this whole M Cave thing as total nonsense and that they believe all that happened is Kenny went out into the wilderness of the Mojave Desert and ultimately got lost and died, and that's fair, I do want to offer up one thing about his description of being near the cave that first time he saw it. He described his body vibrating to the point where he couldn't go any further and he had to turn around and leave. The United States military uses these things called access denial systems around their highly classified installations. Anywhere where you cannot risk someone getting in, like a fence isn't good enough, they use these machines that fire beams at people that get too close. They're non-lethal, but it's like being thrust inside of a microwave. You feel hot and really uncomfortable, and you turn around and you get the heck out of there. The fact that Kenny was right near Area 51, a highly confidential area, regardless of alien conspiracies, it's a known highly confidential base. And he's discovering this strange cave entrance that doesn't look like other cave entrances, and he's walking up to it describing basically what it feels like to be hit with an access denial system. It makes you wonder, did he discover some secret entrance to some secret base? Or is this a bunch of crap and he just got lost in the desert and died? We don't know. But what we do know is that his search for M Cave probably ended his life. And that's why you should never go looking for M Cave. As the sun began to set on August 18, 2010, Ben McDaniel, who was 30 years old, walked to the end of the pier, put on all of his diving equipment, and jumped in the water. He slowly descended 115 feet and came to a stop right in front of a very famous underwater sign. The sign very clearly tells anybody who sees it, do not go any farther unless you are absolutely certain this is the right thing for you to be doing. If you go farther, you're probably going to die, like the 300 other people that have died doing this particular activity. He swam right past that sign and went 300 feet to the very famous underwater locked gate. Now, the only people that have keys to this are extremely experienced divers, and even they don't typically go into this area because it's so dangerous. Ben was not one of the very experienced divers that was given a key, but he still desperately wanted to get to the other side of the gate. So he's sitting there yanking on the gate and he's getting himself kind of pushed inside halfway through the gate and he can't quite get it open. And another diver saw him doing this and was actually concerned that Ben was going to get trapped on the gate itself and would just drown on the gate. And so this diver comes over and uses his key and maybe against his better judgment opened it, thinking that that was better than him getting stuck on the gate. Ben turns to look at him, gives him a nod, thank you, and he, on his own, swims into one of, if not the single most dangerous underwater caves in the whole world. It's called Vortex Spring Cave. From the locked gate, this cave extends another 1,600 feet and goes down to a depth of 310 feet. The majority of this section of the cave is mapped, but there are sections that are not fully explored because they're so narrow, where you have to literally take off your gear, wriggle through a hole, pull your gear through and put it back on. All the while you're barely holding onto your mouthpiece. And so really the full extent of this section of the cave is not known. While we don't know exactly what Ben did when he went through that gate and entered into this extremely dangerous cave, we do know that he didn't come out again. And after a couple of days and no one had seen him, they launched this massive search for him and they combed as much as they could of inside of that cave, but there were sections that they were just not prepared to go search. And so he was never recovered. All they ever found were 2 of Ben's dive bottles. As a total side note, when I was reading about the Vortex Spring Cave, it reminded me of some of the things that we did when I was in the Navy SEAL teams. And one of my least favorite things to do is when we would be swimming in and around ships. We would go under barges. And so a barge has a flat bottom. And sometimes they sit really close to the bottom of the ocean, but there's a little space under there where you can maneuver. And so we would go underneath these barges where there was only a few feet of clearance. And it's totally pitch black. And you're swimming in just total blackness where you're so claustrophobic. You're basically tight in this little space where you're just hoping that nothing causes this barge to sink on me. And by the time you get out the other side, it's like this huge sense of relief. And so that's why this is number 1 on my list, because for me, the idea of being trapped in a little tiny alcove inside of an underwater cave where you can't get out, you're running out of air, it's pitch black. I mean, that is just the absolute worst way to go. That's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments which of these 3 places you might actually want to go check out and why. I'll respond to all the early commenters and I will pin the best overall comment at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please purchase the like button, a one-way plane ticket to North Central. 20th, 2019, 14-year-old Harley Dilly was on his way to school. It was the last day before vacation and he was furious with his parents. The night before, he had gotten into a huge fight with them, and as punishment, they had confiscated his phone. That afternoon, Harley did not come home. So his parents called the school to say, hey, have you seen our son? And they said, well, we know he was here today, but we don't know where he went after that. So the parents called some of Harley's friends, and none of his friends had seen him after school. His parents were worried, but they had seen this kind of behavior before. When Harley got really mad, he had a history of running away from the house and staying out overnight. He usually crashed with some friend and they would cover for him, or sometimes he would even sleep in abandoned buildings. And so that day, the police were not called. The next day, when Harley still didn't show up, the parents started to get a little bit more worried, and because their son didn't even have his phone, they had no way of getting in touch with him. And so they finally said, we gotta go to the police. And so the police launched a formal search for him, and right away there was no leads. Nobody knew where he was. Weeks went by, and the family was putting up posters all over town, telling their son that you're not in trouble, please come home. And everybody in the community is out there looking for Harley, but there was just no sign of him. Finally, almost a month after he had gone missing, the police received a tip. The house across the street from Harley's house was a vacant home because the owners were actually renovating the property, so they weren't living there. But they had cameras set up on the outside, and one of their cameras, when they reviewed it, picked up Harley walking towards their property on the day he went missing. And so the police show up at this property, the owners show up, they give them the key, the police go inside, they're yelling for Harley, they check all the doors and all the windows, and everything is locked, there's no sign of a break-in. They go upstairs, and in one of the bedrooms, they see there's a jacket lying on the ground, and it would turn out to be Harley's. It was the same one he had on when he went missing. And next to the jacket on the ground is this weird metal plate. And so after seeing this, the police believe Harley must be up on the second floor somewhere. He must have been hiding out in this vacant house the whole time. They don't know how he got in, but clearly this is his stuff. And so they start yelling for him and walking around the second floor, and it's silence. There's no sign of Harley. And so they go back in the room where his jacket and this plate is, and they look up on the wall, and pretty high up, there's a hole in the wall. And it looks to be about the same size as this metal plate. And they realize this plate is actually a vent cover, and that is a vent. Suddenly, police believe this could be a lot more sinister, that perhaps someone had harmed Harley and then taken evidence and stuffed it into a vent inside of a vacant house. So one of the officers gets a stool, they put it in front of this vent, they climb on top, and they reach in to feel around for more evidence. And as soon as they reach in, they touch something and they pull their hand back out and they say, there's a person in there. And it would turn out the person inside of there was Harley, and he was deceased. Although no one knows exactly what happened to Harley, the leading theory is he climbed onto the roof of this vacant home on the day he went missing, and he looked down the chimney. There was no cap on it, and from his perspective, it looked like he'd be able to fit all the way down to the bottom. But what he didn't know was this chimney was wider at the top, and then as it went down, it got narrower and narrower and narrower, and in fact, the most narrow section towards the lower half, he never could have got through. This was an impossible thing he was trying to do. But regardless, he went in feet first, and he began making his way down, and then about the halfway point, he started to get stuck. And he believed it was because of his big, bulky jacket. And as it happened, he was right in front of this hole in the wall, which was the vent, and so he managed to punch the metal plate off of the vent. He got his jacket off, and he forced it through this hole, thinking that would give him a little bit more room. And it did. He began to sink a little bit further, and then he decides to put both arms over his head to try to make himself as narrow as possible. And it works. He starts to move down, but at some point he gets completely stuck, and he's struggling to breathe because the chimney is tight in his chest, and he's got his arms over his head, and he's starting to panic, and he lets out a scream. But as soon as he does that, the air coming out of his lungs causes his chest to compress, and he sinks just a little bit lower into that tight section of the chimney. And as soon as he comes to a stop, he tries to breathe back in again, but his chest can no longer expand to its full size, so he can't get a full breath. And so over and over and over again, as he's screaming and yelling for help, he's compressing his chest and sinking farther and farther into this inescapable trap until he reaches a point where he cannot go any lower, and his chest is crushed by the chimney. He can barely catch his breath. His arms are stuck over his head and his feet are dangling off the ground, and that is how he would stay until he suffocated to death. In 2002, Sean Doyle was a 25-year-old bartender who worked at a restaurant in Lower Manhattan in New York City. His regulars described him as a little guy who was very cordial and very friendly. He lived not that far away from the restaurant in an apartment building with his sister Shannon and his dog Emmett. And just down the hall from him was his good friend, 47-year-old Michael Wright. Sean and Michael made an odd pair, not only because of their age difference, but because Michael was actually a huge guy, so the size differential was massive. But they were best buds and they hung out all the time. On December 13th of that year, Sean had just worked a double. He got back to the apartment building and he was ready to cut loose for the weekend. And as soon as he got onto his floor, he looked down the hall and he saw Michael and his girlfriend getting ready to go out for the night. And they flagged him down and said, "Hey, you should join us." And Sean said, "Perfect. This is exactly what I wanted." And so he ran in his apartment, he dropped his stuff, he changed, came back out, and they headed to the bars. That night, the trio had a great time bar hopping all over Lower Manhattan. And then sometime in the early morning hours of December 14th, they decided that they'd had enough to drink and it was time to go home. Now, where they were was only a couple blocks away from their apartment building, so they decided they would just walk. And so they get out on the street and they start walking home, and at some point, Michael gets the impression that Sean is hitting on his girlfriend. It's unclear what gave him this impression, but apparently he really believed it, because as soon as he saw it, he launched an attack on Sean and started just beating him up in the middle of the street. Witnesses who lived in the apartments that were overlooking the street would later say they heard a scuffle outside and they looked out the window and they saw a big guy wailing on a little guy. Then, with the whole neighborhood watching, the big guy, Michael, picked up the little guy, Sean, and shoved him. And Sean flew backwards and he ran into this plastic chimney that was over this manhole. It was there to let steam escape and also to make sure nobody went in the manhole. But when Sean rammed into it, it toppled over, exposing the manhole, and Sean fell 18 feet to the bottom of it. As soon as he landed, witnesses would say they heard a blood-curdling scream. It would turn out the hole he had fallen into was filled with boiling water and scalding steam because of a nearby steam main leak. When police and paramedics arrived, they heard Sean screaming from the hole, and so they ran over and they get to the edge of the hole and they try to look down to get a look at Sean, but they're hit with the steam and it's so hot, so they had to back up. And finally the steam clears and they get a look at Sean, and he's just standing in the middle of this hole up to his waist in water. He's obviously in excruciating pain, and he's just reaching up for them, his back is arched, and he's pleading with them to get him out of this hole. They turned off the steam main and they tried to lower something down to him to try to pull him out, but his body was starting to shut down and he couldn't grab on. So they considered sending a person down to try to put a harness on him and try to get him out that way, but even with the steam main off, it was over 300 degrees inside of this hole, so no one could go down there. And so knowing they could not help him, police, paramedics, and other onlookers just had to walk around the outside of this hole with their hands on their heads, listening to Sean's desperate pleas for help. And finally, after 10 minutes of agony, it went quiet. It would take 4 more hours for that hole to cool off enough that they could send someone down to retrieve his body. Judy Melinek, the famous New York medical examiner who did Sean's autopsy, wrote in her book, Working Stiff, that Sean's death was the worst one she'd ever seen in her entire career. His fight with Michael and his fall into the hole did not contribute to his death. His actual cause of death was being steamed alive. But what makes this the worst death ever is that steam burns, no matter how severe, do not destroy nerve endings the way flames do, which means Sean would have felt everything. Michael was charged with second-degree murder. However, it's not listed online whether or not he was found guilty or what his sentence was. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was employed as an engineer for the German shipping company called Hapag-Lloyd. Over the past year, he had completed 2 separate 4-month-long deployments with this company, and he enjoyed the work enough that he asked for a contract extension. It was granted, and on July 11th of that year, he boarded the CM London Express to begin his 3rd deployment. 3 months into it, one of the ship's pistons broke. The piston is the part of the engine that goes up and down inside the hollow cylinder of the engine block. They would need to turn off the engine in order to make this repair, and so they made an unplanned stop in Savannah, Georgia. Once they got there, Kurt, along with 7 people under his command, headed down to the engine room to begin the process. Over the next several hours, the men were able to extract the broken piston and put in the new one. But this was back-breaking work. It was so hot in the engine room. What they're moving around is so heavy and cumbersome, and they're all bickering with each other. And at some point, Kurt called out the foreman for being lazy, and the foreman did not like that, and he was very popular amongst this group. And so by the end of getting the piston back in, everybody in there just totally resented Kurt. But ultimately, they got it done, and Kurt cut everybody loose except for the foreman. He told him he needed to stay back and help him ensure all the pistons were properly installed. To do that, they would need to go inside of something called the scavenger air receiver, which is this tube that's 55 feet long by 5 feet wide with access hatches on either side, and it sits right next to the engine block. Each hatch on either end had 3 latches on the outside that were called dogs. And so Kurt undid the 3 dogs on his hatch and he opened it up. He crawled inside of the tube with his flashlight and he began crawling. And on his left side were these square cutouts, these windows called scavenger ports that looked into each of the engine cylinders. And so Kurt crawled along counting the different cylinders until he got to the 6th one, which is where they had replaced that piston. Meanwhile, the foreman went around to the aft hatch. He undid the 3 dogs. He opened up the hatch. And then using a remote controlled device, he was able to bring the pistons into position safely so Kurt could inspect them through the scavenger scavenger port. The procedure on the ship was if you were inspecting one cylinder, the expectation is you would inspect all of them. And that entire process took about an hour, and Kurt just didn't feel like doing it. He was tired, he had a bad day, he was hungry. And so after he was certain the new piston was working just fine, he kind of rushed his checks on the other cylinders, and after only about 20 minutes, he told the foreman that, yep, we're good, we can leave. So he and the foreman got out, they dogged their hatches, and they headed up to their rooms to change. Their captain had been told they had to leave port no later than 9:30 that night because a huge tanker was coming in and there'd be no space for them. But at 8 p.m., as everyone is running around prepping the ship, somebody noticed Kurt was not at his workstation. The chief engineer called down to the engine room to ask anyone down there if they had seen Kurt, but nobody had. So a sailor was sent down to Kurt's cabin to see if he was in there, but he wasn't. At this point, because they only had about an hour until they were departing, they had to find Kurt. So they sounded the alarm on their ship, which was a little bit premature, but they figured, let's get everybody involved and just find Kurt. And so everybody stopped what they were doing and began searching the ship. During the search, a sailor was down near the scavenger air recovery space, and he noticed on the forward hatch there was a little piece of rag poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower two dogs were not set. He knew they were having issues getting a good seal on this particular hatch because there was a divot in one of the O-rings. And so he figured someone must have put a rag right over that divot to try to help seal this hatch, and they just forgot to shut the two lower dogs. Now, it did cross this sailor's mind that Kurt could have gotten inside of the scavenger air recovery space and then somehow got locked inside. And so he did want to investigate. However, there was a very strict policy about who was allowed to actually open up these scavenger air recovery hatches. And it wasn't the sailor. It was only the foreman, the chief engineer, and Kurt. And so this sailor decided to play it safe and just close the lower two dogs, and then told his superior that there was this weird rag poking out of the forward hatch and that someone should go down there and open it up and see if Kurt's inside. And so his superior went and told the chief engineer. And so as the chief engineer is making his way down to check on this strange rag situation, the foreman, completely independently, had gone around to the back of the scavenger unit to the aft hatch, so not the one with the rag poking out of it, and he unlocked the three dogs, he opened the hatch, he looked inside and shined his light, didn't see anyone, shut the hatch, locked all three dogs, and then began to walk away right as the chief engineer came down and saw him. And he saw him securing the scavenger air unit, and he said, hey, I was just coming down here to check to make sure Kurt wasn't in there, and you just checked, right? He's not in there? And the foreman said, yeah, no one's in there, it's all good. And so the two of them, the foreman and the chief engineer, did not check on the rag. They just left. The search for Kurt continued on the ship, but they could not find him. And so as 9:30 was approaching, the captain called the port authority and he said, hey, we're down someone. Can you please send someone out to look around? And so a search on the land began, but they couldn't find Kurt. And so finally 9:30 came around, and the big container ship that was supposed to come in and take their place was just waiting right out in the water for them to leave. And so the captain did his best to linger for another 10-15 minutes, but finally they were forced to leave, even though they had no idea where Kurt was. So they fired up the engine and they left. The general consensus on the ship was that Kurt must have fallen overboard and drowned. Or maybe he ran ashore and ran off, but that was very unlike him. And so an investigation was launched, but it would probably be a while before anybody found out what happened to him. Finally, 2 days later, they arrived in port at Norfolk, Virginia. They powered off the engine and they got the ship ready to be put into harbor mode, where basically they open up all the hatches and they prep it to sit there for a while. And during that process, the foreman went down to the scavenger air recovery space and he opened up the forward hatch and he found Kurt. Although no one has all the details of what happened to Kurt, the leading theory is 2 days earlier, when he had done that abbreviated check of the engine cylinders, when he had basically cut it short with the foreman because he just didn't want to do it, he had gotten back up to his room and started to think to himself that if anything goes wrong with any of those pistons, that I'm going to be to blame because the foreman was with me and I called the foreman lazy earlier and he doesn't like me, and so he's bound to turn me in. So Kurt decided he would go back down and do a more thorough check. But he didn't want anybody to know he was second guessing himself, and so he was going to do this alone, even though it was a huge no-no to go inside of the scavenger air unit by yourself. Because if you manage to get stuck in there by yourself, horrible things are going to happen to you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But Kurt was confident, so he headed down, he undogged the forward hatch, he swung it inside, he climbed in with his flashlight, and then somehow, once he got inside, he managed to fall backwards and hit the hatch door so hard that it swung shut, slammed, causing the upper dog to swivel and rotate down and lock him inside. He knew that nobody knew he was in there. He had made sure that nobody knew he was in there. He screamed for help, but nobody could hear him. The ship was so loud as it it was, and being inside of this tunnel, no sounds getting out of it. And so he's looking around thinking what he should do, and he looks back at the door, the one that's sealed right behind him, and he sees the very top crack, there's a tiny sliver of light. Because even though one dog had sealed him in, because the other two had not, there was a little gap in the seal. And so he thought if he can just wedge his dirty rag into that little space and push it out onto the other side, someone will see it, will clearly recognize there's a foreign object hanging off of the forward hatch, and they'll have to open it up and they'll find me. And so once he wedged his rag up and through, he was confident he would be found. And so he slouched down against the back of the hatch and he just sat there waiting to be found. And then a little while later, he heard the sound of somebody not opening the hatch behind him as he thought they would, but instead locking the two dogs, making sure it doesn't open. He must have got up and turned around and screamed for them, but again, they can't hear him. And then a couple of minutes later, on the other side of the tube, 55 feet away, the aft hatch opened up briefly. Somebody shined their light in. It didn't hit him. He tried to yell for them. They didn't hear him. And then he saw them shut the hatch and he heard the sound of them locking all three dogs. At this point, you got to figure that Kurt's fear is at a primal level. He knows at any moment, if somebody doesn't get him out of here, this is going to become a death trap. And so as he's looking around, just wondering what's going to happen, he would have felt the incredible pressure start to build up in his ears. It would have taken him to his knees, it would have been crushing in his skull, and he would have heard the sound of each of the hatches being pressed up against their O-ring as the room began to pressurize. And then he would have heard the sound of the pistons beginning to churn inside of the engine cylinder right next to him. And at that point, he would know there's no hope. And slowly, horribly, that room would begin to heat up until Kurt was cooked alive. So that's going to...
With that fire, hit that back eyes like a dare. Said my name like a secret, left it shaking in the air. Your heel tapped out, trouble on the tile by the door. I was calm for a second, then you pulled me off the floor. Hey, you know what you do when you look like that? My chest goes down, my knees go flat. One step closer and I lose my line. Say my name again. Came in like a storm, blue dress, red wine stain. Left your shoes by the door, then said my name again. I watched you laugh so hard you bent the whole room over. Now the floorboards know how you move like no other. Oh, you cut me clean with the little grin. One look from you and I'm back in it. Soul on the table, soul on the table. You turn my slow heart into a fire.
Gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a scoop of their favorite ice cream, but beforehand, put an elephant laxative inside. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's MrBallen416. I also have a ton of content